What's good, everybody? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Over Quota. Please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review if you haven't already. Don't forget to tell your friends, colleagues, and whomever, because we really want to grow this podcast. And like always, the J. David Group, which is my company, is sponsoring this podcast. My company helps high-growth software companies recruit top software sales leaders and salespeople. Go to the jdavidgroup.com/hiring to learn more, or go to the jdavidgroup.com/looking if you're looking for your next big challenge. Now, my guest today, and bear with me because he's got a lot going on. My guest today is Samuel Clemens. He's a partner at Accomplice, which is a seed-led venture capital firm where he focuses on B2B software and marketplace investments. He's also the co-founder of Reprise, which enables customer-facing teams to capture, edit, and assemble the perfect demo, which I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. And he's also a lecturer at the Harvard Business School, where he teaches a course called Launching Tech Ventures, which focuses on early-stage issues like product market fit, business model, and creation of the go-to-market engine. And one of the things that I found that's most exciting about him is he also co-founded a company by the name of Insight Squared. I find it exciting because I was an end user of that product and geeked out over it like probably no other product, except for maybe HubSpot at one point, but which is a business analytics tool, like I said, that I've personally used. So Sam, it's a pleasure to have you on Over Quota.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's just start with a little bit of what I just ended with, which with Reprise and Accomplice. Tell us a little bit more about those, about those.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I wear three hats at the moment, but the common thread is that all of my background is early stage software, and it's also very much on the B2B side, which I think is probably applicable for your audience. So Accomplice is indeed a seed stage investment firm based out of Boston, although does investments both on the East Coast and the West Coast, and invests across the entire technology spectrum. But within that, my area of focus is B2B. And then Reprise is a seed stage project that I'm incubating with three of my previous colleagues. It's my previous co-founder and CTO from Insight Squared. It's our head of sales from Insight Squared, and one of our sales ops managers from Insight Squared. So the four of us are getting together and we're incubating a new project, and that's actually serving sales and marketing leaders at B2B enterprise companies, which again might be interesting for your audience. That project, Reprise, what we're doing is we're building a platform for sales and marketing teams to make their own demos. So if a sales team has ever been frustrated with the demo that it doesn't really kind of fit their script, or if a marketing team wished they had like a touchless product tour that they could send out to prospects, that's what we're building, is the ability for them to do that on their own without needing an engineering team to build it for them. And we're still early in that product development on that. So to the extent that your audience is interested, we'd very much welcome input from your listeners on what they would want from that kind of a platform.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you just a question on that. So let's say, for instance, if I've created a demo, I'm a sales ops person or sales leader, and we're creating demos for the team. And let's say, for instance, I'm a individual contributor on that team, and I create a demo that I'm customizing. Is it one of those things where, let's say, for instance, if I'm sending the demo or I'm giving a particular demo, that I can go and change it almost instantly or immediately if, on the next prospect call, so to speak, if I want to? Is that simple and sort of intuitive?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the point of the platform, is that you don't need code to change anything.
Mm-hmm.
We ingest your the front end of your current production app. So it's going to look entirely like your production app, but then we allow you to start from there and then customize anything. If you want to change the numbers, the names, if you want to make an enterprise version of your demo that has, large dollar amounts, and then an SMB version, or if you want to anonymize the names, or if you want to even change the way things are linked or flow, basically it's all under your control. You don't need code to do it. And then you can publish that either to use for yourself on a demo call, or you could even publish it and then send out a link to a prospect as like a leave behind. Instead of giving them a PDF as a leave behind, you can give them a link that they could then say show around to the others on their team, which is useful when you're a sales leader or you're a sales rep and you're trying to get buy-in and multiple touch points across an account, and you need a way for those multiple touch points to experience and see what you can potentially offer them. A PDF can kind of fall short sometimes. The person you spoke to had the benefit of seeing the product, but the others won't see that. And so how do you give your champion a way to get support in that account?
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. And I'm assuming there's a way for people to even see a demo of this. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay,
And come
cool.
to our website. It's getreprise.com.
I'll link to it in the show notes too as well, because I'm actually curious about seeing it as well. There was something else that you were going to say that I cut you off before. Do you remember what you were going to say? Did I lose you? Move on.
Keep moving.
All right, no problem. You mentioned the head of sales there at Reprise that you got from Insight Squared. Before we get into that first initial hire as a sales leader at Insight Squared, and why you decided to bring him over at Reprise, talk to me a little bit about the beginning there of Insight Squared in terms of where the first customers came from before you decided to bring on your first sales leader. Yeah.
So I've done a number of projects on the B2B side. Before Reprise, it was Insight Squared. Before Insight Squared, I led product at HubSpot. Before that, it was a couple other early stage startups. At all of them, the early stage customers that you want for a B2B project are typically the ones you know, that you already know. Because your goal at the early stage, at that very early stage, is to validate a whole bunch of things like the pain point, the possible price, the identity of the buyer, and might be multiple personas, the messaging. So there's all these things that you're running tests. Think of it as like an experimental machine. You're running all these tests and trying to figure out all these things. And so that's really the point of the early stage is the discovery. It's not scaling. And so it's okay to choose a non-scalable way of getting pipeline at the early stage, like going to prospects that you already know. In fact, you might even say that if you're starting a project in an area where you don't know any possible buyers, you probably shouldn't be starting that project in the first place, because you probably don't have enough intuition about what the pain points are. So in the early stage, the customers come from ones you already know, and you're using it for discovery, and you're not worrying about scaling. You're thinking mainly about learning.
And when you say the ones you already know, you're not necessarily talking about the ones you already know in terms of customers. You're talking about, I think I heard you say, prospects you already know. In other words, if you have, product, that's what you're trying to figure out, like that product market fit type deal. And if you have the product and you're based on all of the information that you have, the research, understanding of the market and the problem that you're trying to solve, you're going to find where those prospects are. And that could be at events, conferences that used to happen, of course, in those types of things, or obviously some sort of marketing campaign that you're going to target to those customers to start getting feedback, validate and all that stuff. Is that right?
Well, actually, at the early stage, I wouldn't even use a marketing campaign.
Okay.
I'd say that, let's say you're doing a mid-market ACV, you're selling at 50K a year SaaS, 35, 50K. You need, at that early stage, you don't need 600 or 60 customers, you need 6. Mm-hmm. You don't need to run a marketing campaign to get 6 customers. You can go out and, 1 or 2 or 3 of them you probably already know because you had the idea for this startup from someplace. And it's probably from those 1 or 2 or 3 companies that you already know and you've already spoken to. And those 1 or 2 or 3 companies, if you actually solve this problem for them, they're going to say, oh, you should actually talk to so-and-so over at that other company as well. So you can get from the 1 or 2 or 3 that you already know from the idea to 3, 4, 5, 6. And really that's enough at the early stage, because that half dozen will be enough for you to go through this learning phase, this discovery phase. And it doesn't have to be scalable. It's basically direct connections, word of mouth, no marketing campaigns at all.
And how important?
That's the early stage.
Okay, that makes sense. And how important, speaking of direct connections and that type of thing, how important were your early investors in introducing you perhaps to some of these early prospects or customers?
It's super important, incredibly important. And so that's one of the reasons why when you're picking an investor, it helps to not just pick the firm that you're working with, but also the individual partner, because different partners will have different areas of focus. Some will be very B2C, some will be very B2B. Within B2B, some might be, have depth in cybersecurity. Others might have depth in SaaS. And so when you work with an investor who's good at the early stage, they're used to being able to do things like, hey, here's some team that they can help you hire. But also what they can do is say, hey, how about some introductions? I know through having done investments in this area for 10 years, here are 3 companies you may want to speak to, and let me do an introduction. And you can go directly to who the potential buyer might be through, basically email introductions. That's not scalable, but it doesn't have to be. And that's the point. Is at that early stage, you don't have to be scalable. You're going for quality, not quantity.
Yep, that makes sense. That makes sense. So let's go beyond that a little bit, right? So you have the early customers that you just mentioned, and the way that you got them. You're validating. You're answering some of those questions that you mentioned in terms of pain point, what the right pricing is, all those types of things a little bit, anyways. At what point did you decide to start to bring on your first sales leader, and what were the indicators to you that said this is what needs this is why we need to bring this person on? And did you have any other non-founder salespeople on before you brought your sales leader on? Or was the sales leader essentially would be wearing multiple hats, I guess, right? Sales and sales leadership eventually.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's actually one of the most crucial questions that early stage startups need to figure out is, when do you bring on, as you said, the first non-founder salesperson? I would think about it in essentially maybe 3 stages of development for an early stage project when it comes to a sales leader. The first stage is the founder selling stage. And that's when, as we mentioned before, the main goal is discovery, but also the product is going to be very raw. It's at its most raw because it's the earliest. And so you need that founder unfair advantage of enthusiasm and passion for the thing that they've founded in order to get over the hump, and in order to get past the rawness of the product and get those first 3, 4, 5, 6 deals done. So it's actually a fortunate coincidence that at that first stage, the founder selling is perfect, A, because they need to be getting the learning. That's the point of the first stage. But also B, only the founder can get past the rawness of the product. And so first stage, it's founder selling. It has to be. The second stage is you've gotten those first half dozen deals closed. And now you're starting to think about, okay, how do we actually start to build a repeatable motion here, a repeatable sales motion? But you don't actually know what the motion is yet. And what the founder was doing was not repeatable. They may not even have been a salesperson. And so there may not be any kind of, what you would call best practices in what they were doing. They're using introductions from investors, and they were just kind of like, using passion to get past whatever the objections were. So in the second stage, you need a sales leader who can come in and actually figure out the playbook, because there isn't one. And so in the second stage, I think the best sales leader for a company is this like expeditionary sales leader. They're the first non-founder sales leader, and they have to discover the playbook. And so you need someone who has actually carried quota recently enough, because the way they're going to discover that playbook is going out and doing it themselves, closing the initial deals and testing things, figuring it out. So they're going to have to actually go out and close deals themselves. And so it's going to require a lot of experimentation, a lot of self-direction on the part of that sales leader. So that's why I think of this as the expeditionary sales leader. The third phase is a very different kind of leader, is much more of a process-based sales leader. So the expeditionary sales leader, they took it from just themselves as the first non-founder salesperson, and maybe they scaled it up. They basically discovered the playbook, and they scaled the sales team from themselves to 6 reps, 8 reps, basically 1 team's worth. And now for this third phase, you say, okay, we want to go from 1 team to 3 teams. How do you do that? Very often the expeditionary sales leader, while they were very good at discovering that initial playbook, their expertise is not in the human management side, the scaling side. They were able to get to 6 reps because they kind of copied what they do themselves, but going from 6 reps to 18 is going to be a very different ball game. And so for this third phase, you want more of a process leader. You want someone who's actually managed teams before. They may not be good. In fact, they're likely not good at discovering a playbook. They would likely be horrible at the second stage. But they're very good. If you give them a playbook, they're very good at refining it and then managing that from 1 team to 3 teams to 5 teams. So 3 different phases and 3 very different kind of sales leaders. The first one is the founder sales leader. The second one is the expeditionary sales leader. And the third one is the process first, the process-based sales leader.
Because it's all so new and unprecedented when somebody is getting in there and, like you said, discovering the playbook and just sort of dovetailing off of the passion of the founder and all of those early stage things that aren't necessarily repeatable. You know, how challenging, I guess, is it for a new expeditionary sales leader to come in and discover and create that playbook? In other words, I feel like just from the outside looking in, there's a lot of continuing of testing the messaging and those types of things, and sales process, maybe even, you know, I've seen companies where, you know, they thought that the enterprise level customers were the way to go, but really they should go down market and sell to mid-market because they want to get the cash in faster and shorten the sales cycles and those types of things. Talk to me about how that's working within the first team, so to speak, and what's your, I don't want to use the word patience, I guess, but like what, from an investor's perspective, right, as you're seeing this and knowing this, what are you thinking, and what should that sales leader, I guess, be trying to figure out, and how fast? I don't know.
Yeah, patience is a good word, actually, because as an investor, you know that a lot of this stuff is still getting figured out. You mentioned, like, are they going enterprise, mid-market, SMB? What are the use cases that are going to resonate most? May not be what the founder was initially selling. So yeah, all this stuff, that whole playbook still needs to get figured out. Patience is good. One of the things that'll be different often at the start of the second stage versus, say, the third is that there's not likely to be revenue targets because you're still figuring out, like, are we going enterprise or mid-market? Well, the revenue targets are going to be totally different. The sales cycles are going to be totally different. You know, mid-market, you're going to have a 30 to 60 day sales cycle. Enterprise, you're going to have a 90-day sales cycle. And so if you're still trying to figure out which way are you going there, then you're not able to set any credible revenue target because you don't know what the delay between opportunities to closing to revenue will be. So patience is good because it's more of a figuring out thing. If you're coming in as that expeditionary sales leader, the main thing you need to focus on is figuring it out as opposed to committing to revenue targets. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
The best hire that I like for this is you get a director level hire, someone who's a director level at a current B2B software company in what you think is the same ACV category. So if you're a startup, if you're a founder in your startup, if you think you're going mid-market, or if you think you're going SMB, then go and get a director level sales manager at a company that's currently selling to SMB or currently selling to mid-market. And you'll get 2 benefits from that. One is by director level, they'll have a bit of a chip on their shoulder. They'll have learned enough, but they want to go out and prove themselves. It'll be the first time that they're leading sales at a company by themselves. And so that chip on the shoulder will give them drive. At the same time, because they're director level, they'll have seen enough that they'll have the raw options to choose in assembling and discovering the playbook at the new company. I think that works better than if you bring in someone who's a VP at a previous company. May not have enough drive because, they were already a leader and now they're a leader again. They don't have that extra chip on the shoulder. Or if you bring in someone who's a rep at a previous company, they may not have enough experience to draw upon in figuring out the new playbook.
And also that leader that may have been a leader already may have been, to your point, may have been too far removed from the sales process, whereas the director may not have, certainly just by nature was not, right?
Yeah, you need someone, when they're discovering the playbook, they're going to be closing their own deals to see if something works. So it would be good if they had actually carried quota within the last 12 months. If the last time they carried quota was 8 years ago, then you don't want to put them back in the seat again to try and figure that out. That would not be a good fit.
And just to follow up on a couple of things, you mentioned revenue not being a target. I would imagine that then wins, right, or the logos are really the number that you're looking at, right? The metric that you're looking at to say, okay, yes, we're making progress. And then how often are we getting these wins, right? Are they taking us 9 months or?
Yeah, exactly. So at the 3 stage, at the very early stage, it's really about the learning. At the second stage, I mentioned this before, it's quality, not quantity. So what an investor would look at, for example, is the quality of the deals. Was the ACV what it should be? If you're going mid-market, are you getting 30 or 50K ACVs, or are you getting 12? If you're going mid-market, but you're getting a 12K ACV, that's going to be a problem later on, because you've got a mid-market sales motion with a mid-market cost, if you will, of acquisition and conversion. But then you've got an SMB lifetime value of the customer. That's not going to pan out well in the economics. So when I say quality, one of the things I mean for quality is, are you getting enough value per deal? Another aspect of quality might be the engagement. Did you actually sell to a use case where the customer is really engaging with the product? They're using it. They're coming, whether it's frequency of usage or depth of usage, or deploying it to their internal team, whatever the metric is for your product. Do you have good post-sales engagement? Those are all things that matter when you go from the the 6th deal to the 60th.
Could that be within there? You mentioned quality and having, perhaps your ACV is too low for the market. Is there a possibility there as well that maybe the product is just better fit for an SMB, and then all of a sudden there's a little bit of a pivot that has to change?
Sure.
And that's something that I'm assuming that person that's sitting in that seat is going to have to figure out, right?
Yeah. So I mean, that actually, it's one of the most common failure modes when you're setting up, when you're essentially discovering the sales motion at an early stage company, is not having alignment between what the product solves, what the kind of pipeline that marketing is generating, the kind of deals that sales is closing, and then the kind of usage you get afterwards. If you don't have alignment between those things, you get sadness. So an example would be, you've got a company that thinks they're going mid-market, and they design they design the product for mid-market usage, but they end up selling it to SMB at an SMB price point. That's going to create sadness now, because you've got misalignment between what the product is designed for and who it's being sold to. And in fact, if you're using a mid-market heaviness of sales motion with an SMB customer and an SMB price point, that'll create sadness, because now you've got a high cost of acquisition with a low value per customer. Unit economics won't work out. So one of the things you want is, I'm not saying SMB is good or bad, or mid-market is good or bad. What I'm saying is alignment. Mm-hmm. If you have an SMB product, then you want to be using an SMB go-to-market motion. So much more, for example, on the marketing side, much more around content marketing, much more of a two-touch, much more transactional sales motion, shorter sales cycles, much more one-to-many onboarding post-sales. Those would be all aligned, things that are aligned on the SMB side. If you're going mid-market, instead of content marketing, you might use, for example, account-based marketing. Your sales motion would be more trained for 60-day sales cycle, multiple touch points within an account. Your onboarding might be one-to-one instead of one-to-many. So these are all things that would be alignment for a mid-market go-to-market motion. What you want to be careful early on when you're designing these things is not having alignment between those.
Yep, that makes sense. And then just one follow-up question regarding the, you mentioned, this team would be big enough for the first, this person would lead the first team, so to speak, maybe 6 to 8 people and those types of things. How important is, well, 2 things. How important is it that this director level person has come from a similar culture, if you will, right? In other words, there are director level people, let's say at companies that like Salesforce, right? Or even HubSpot at this point. And then there are direct level salespeople that are at a smaller company, let's say like an Insight Square or something like that, or even smaller, right? In other words, does that matter that they've come from a company that may have more resources, more infrastructure than a seed stage startup, or a smaller startup, or does that not matter?
I think it matters less. I think what you're looking for is the drive and the knowledge of options in the playbook that they can use to discover the new playbook at the new company. I think of culture as something that is really has to be defined by the founders initially. And it's, in my opinion, culture is defined by how the organization chooses to solve the hard problems that crop up. Those are the things that people remember, right? It's not the writing on the wall. It's how the organism reacted to threats. That's what sticks, right? That's what people actually internalize. And so that might be, for example, the sales team has a prospect that is pretty clearly not a fit for the product. But for the first year, it might give a nice, attractive, check. But everyone knows they're going to churn after a year. Does the organism choose to take essentially the bad deal, or do they reject it? That's a choice up front, and that would influence, for example, the sales culture. I think that's the kind of thing that really needs, choices like that need to really be defined by right at the top, right by the founders.
Got it. That makes sense. And the bad deal that you reject, I'm just curious on that. I'm assuming that the bad deal, even though it's money now, you almost probable that they go into churn. But in the interim, what's happening is that there are internal resources that are being sucked up, so to speak, right? That aren't freed up for what you really want, which are the better customers that aren't going to churn. Is that right?
Yeah. So maybe let's not use the word bad. Let's just say a deal where there's no initial fit. It's a culture choice. Do you want to take things like that and then try and work them later? Or do you want to reject them up front? Another choice might be, you've got a sales rep that doesn't do things according to the playbook. They kind of just do it their own way. But they're making numbers. Does the group reject them, or does the group say, hey, whatever works? These are culture choices. There is no right or wrong. It's really how you want to define the culture at your company. And I think a lot of them are, back to your original point of like, how much is the sales leader expected to define that culture? I think a lot of this actually comes on the founders.
Okay. What was surprising to you about, or what did you even learn when you first hired that first sales leader that maybe, some of the stuff that we're talking about now, right? Like that you discovered that was either good, bad, indifferent, and how did that sales leader maneuver and work in the way that was needed?
Yeah, I think there's maybe 3 broad categories of like ways I've screwed this up over the years. The first was, the biggest one is you get the wrong leader for the wrong stage. Right away, things get very difficult at that point. And typically it's because you're getting someone who's for the next stage versus where you are. It's typically, you bring in a real process-based, SVP leader at their current company in to be your first expeditionary sales leader at your early stage startup. or you bring in, you make a sales, that you hire that expeditionary sales leader, the second stage leader, when you really should be doing founder selling, because the product is so raw that it has to be founder selling it. So made that mistake a number of times, is wrong leader for the stage you're at. A number of times I've had misalignment, the second big bucket of mistakes, misalignment in the playbooks. So between what marketing was generating, what sales was closing, what post-sales was onboarding and retaining, and misalignment, at the price points, at the type of pipeline coming in, all of it. All that stuff has to be aligned, and if it's not, that's bad. A third general bucket that's bitten me a few times is premature scaling. So this would be, you often see this when you start to scale the go-to-market side, but for some reason, some other part of the org is not ready for that scaling. So, if you've got 6 functions in an org, marketing, sales, customer success, product engine ops, it's very easy, typically, relatively speaking, to scale a sales org. You can just add more heads. It's much harder to scale oftentimes the other parts of the org. So for example, product might not be ready for scaling. It might not have the features for where you're going. Or marketing may not be ready for scaling. You could be in that third phase where you've got this process-based sales leader. They've got 6 reps. They can very quickly go from 6 reps to 18. Marketing may not be able to generate enough food for them to do that. And that creates a colossal problem, because suddenly now you've got triple the number of sales reps, same amount of pipeline coming in. You're going to get starved reps that suddenly you're going to start to see per rep productivity dropping, conversion rates going down, all sorts of sadness that occurs. So premature scaling is I think is a common problem that can occur at really any stage. Both at the early stages, as well as later on when it can happen at under $1 million, but can also happen very commonly around, say, the 10 million run rate.
Is the sales leader responsible for communicating that, let's say, to you on a quarterly basis or something, or however often, I suppose? Maybe it's the CEO and saying, hey, our goal here is to maybe hit a certain revenue, let's just say target. Let's say we are in the revenue stage right now, and we need, the indicators are that we need to add headcount, but we've added too much here at this point, or some of the other things, I guess you can say, whether it's misalignment and that type of thing. Are they responsible for sort of looking at that, or how much do you rely on them to give you that information before it's too late, so that you can sort of make those changes and adjust accordingly?
Yeah, that's one of the things that is a critical success attribute for that process-based sales leader, for example, is they need to know how their process works and what it's dependent on. It's not enough just to have a leader who's good at hiring more heads and training more heads. They need to understand really like the inputs and the outputs from their stage of the machine. So they need to know, for example, what kind of pipeline their process is designed to ingest. And the pipeline coming from marketing is not just all uniform, right? There's going to be different qualities of leads coming in from different sources. Those might be handled by BDRs or AEs differently. And so the manager of that sales process needs to know, how do I design what I'm doing according to the different types of inputs I'm getting from marketing? And that if I go and double one portion of my sales org, how does that affect what I need from marketing? If I blindly double it, then yeah, that's not going to work. So they absolutely have to be aware of what they're doing will affect what they need from sales, and also how it will affect downstream the post-sales org. they absolutely have to be aware of that, and they absolutely have to communicate that as they're growing, here's what they will need from the functions upstream of them, and here's what they'll need from the functions downstream of them.
So that process leader needs to be, essentially operationally sound and use data, essentially be able to use and analyze data in a way that can help them make these decisions and then communicate that effectively
Yeah,
to affect
yeah,
change.
I'd say that that's actually another key thing that you will often see. That another key attribute of sales leaders is that they have to be able to evolve. The sales craft is changing as we, as our customer needs and behaviors change. Even B2B customers these days have more expectations about being able to get information about the product just by Googling it. And even enterprise buyers and B2B customers expect to be able to try out and see the product without having to speak to a sales rep. 10 years ago, that's crazy, but today it's common. And so you need sales leaders that can evolve and adapt. If you have a sales leader, who came up through the ranks, just doing cold calling, and they, that's their hammer, and they expect everything to be a nail, they're not going to be able to handle the new customer expectations and behaviors. So, for example, product-led growth is a huge movement within the B2B go-to-market world right now. That's an example of how you need sales leaders who can figure out how to take advantage of product-led growth and incorporate that into their playbook.
Tell me more about that when you say product-led growth. Give me an example of maybe a company in your portfolio or somebody that you've seen is doing it really well that will crystallize it.
Yeah, so I'll give you the sort of the counter example and then the example. So the counter example would be, the enterprise sales company of 15 years ago, where their only marketing was what appeared on Gartner. Are you in the Gartner Magic Quadrant? And the only material you had was a PDF that got sent out, and the only way you could actually see the product was on a phone call with a rep. Now contrast that, fast forward to today, 15 years later. Yes, you might still be in the Gartner Magic Quadrant, but customers expect to be able to get information about the product by Googling it and seeing what might be available on your website in the form of images, documentation, basically having aspects of your product information more exposed and not behind like a login. The conversion process, the pre-sales, a customer today might expect to be able to actually click through a product tour and see something about the product without having to hop on a phone call with a rep. And so they call that, these are all aspects of product-led growth, meaning you can generate pipeline and begin to convert a customer using your product, whether it's information about the product, seeing the product, even taking a tour of the product. It's not saying you don't have a rep that might still be involved to close it, but it's saying that a lot of the process up through then is becoming much more product involved.
Have you seen anyone successfully, you're talking about adapt and evolve, have you seen anybody successfully make the transition from, one sales leader to the next, so that they can go from that first sales hire, so to speak, to scale? And is it just really about having that growth mindset, right? In other words, being able to learn really quickly and adapt to the information that they're seeing in front of them? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, let me maybe separate that into two dimensions of evolving. One is being able to evolve and adapt to different customer expectations and the channels available today. Things like product-led growth, or things like how people use LinkedIn. That's one aspect of evolving that I think all sales leaders need to have. Otherwise, you won't be able to do the craft as it changes year on year. So every sales leader needs to be able to evolve in that way. Separate from that, I think is the sales leader better suited towards the the more expeditionary type of work versus the more process-based work. And I think that's actually just a personality thing, where they enjoy working most. The expeditionary type of early stage sales leadership is very high on the uncertainty. You're navigating in a heavy fog. You're having to work with, things still being figured out in product and customer success and marketing. And so you have to be very uncomfortable or very comfortable with the uncertainty. And in fact, you need to enjoy it, because if you don't enjoy it, if you just endure it, you're not going to like it.
Right.
Conversely, the later stage, more process-based sales leader, you have to be very good with just working with humans, because you're going to go from 6 reps to 18 to 60. If you don't like managing large teams and dealing with humans, you're not going to enjoy that job.
Let me ask you this: if one has a propensity for one, right? In other words, one has a propensity for scale and those types of things, and the other has the propensity for sort of the ambiguity that comes with the early stage. Given that, okay, maybe this is a hard question to answer, I guess, but where do most people struggle, given they have those skills already? They're already aligned with where they should be. But is one, from, I guess, your perspective as a founder or as an investor, just a more difficult stage of growth and all this other stuff than the other? Or is it just sort of, no, okay.
No, they're both hard in their own ways.
Okay.
I think the challenge usually comes when a sales leader hasn't thought about what stage, isn't essentially aware of the different stages. And therefore they go, apply for roles at the wrong stage. That, I think, is where most of the challenge comes from. I don't think one stage is any inherently harder than the other. They're just different.
Okay. Let's say, for instance, somebody is struggling, and either they're struggling or it's just obvious based on what you just told me that there needs to be a change, right? Like, what does that process look like for you in terms of, and I guess even the expeditionary would be a pretty good prescriptive example, because would that person, knowing that they like that early stage stuff to begin with, right? Would that person be seen as someone who can still be an asset to the organization? And then the conversation happens where it's like, we're going to get somebody else now to take over, but we still want you here. Or is it just, we want somebody else entirely, we're going to move this person out? And then what does that process look like as far as finding the next person?
Yeah, so let's separate. Are they struggling doing the expeditionary type of discovery work? Or are they struggling trying to scale the org, from 6 to 60?
The 6 to 60. Let's take that one first.
Right. So if they're scaling at that, then this is actually like not a surprise, because you're asking, one category of person to do something that is really not what they're best suited for. And so I think really that comes down to is do the founders, the CEO, does the rest of the org have awareness that there's different kinds of sales stages? And does the sales leader themselves have awareness that there's different kinds of sales stages that need different kinds of skills? If they have that awareness, then it's obvious to everyone that now the company has changed and it needs a different set of skills. And so it's not a negative thing to say, okay, now we need to bring in a more process-based sales leader. The one who is the expeditionary sales leader should say, awesome, that's great. I don't want to go do that, frankly. I don't want to go run a 200-person sales org. I would not want to go to work in the morning. I want to go figure out and tackle the unknown, uncertainty, ambiguity, the early stage stuff. And so they should go find another project. Basically, they've succeeded. They won. They got the company to the point where it now needs the process-based leader. They should consider that a victory and then go find another one. So I think the real challenge is do they have awareness about the fact that the game has changed?
How do you know that, I guess, as a founder, let's just say, as you're looking at these things, in other words, that there is a bottleneck now, right? In other words, and maybe it's an inexperienced founder and they haven't seen this before, and they're at a point where it should be clear that a new sales leader needs to come on because there is a bottleneck and they're not successfully scaling.
Yeah.
How do you help them think through that? And I guess that goes to the question of having the right board and having the right investors, perhaps, that not just the money, but have the experience to sort of walk them through that.
Yeah, I think the answer is you need to get smart about this stuff. When you're building a company, it's a shame if your idea is great, but you get a false negative and the company fails because you didn't know enough about the company building pieces, independent of how good your idea was. You didn't know about marketing or sales or product or engineering or finance or customer success. So yeah, I mean, that's part of what makes founding a company in the early stage so exciting and challenging, is that you need to get smart in so many different aspects of building a company. You're building the V1 of each of the functions of a company. And so yeah, the first stage is you got to get smart about this stuff. I think the first way is to do that is, there's some fantastic podcasts available these days that one can go and listen to about how to do sales well. Like, forget boards for a minute, just go on the internet and learn how to do each of the functions, the V1 of each of your company's functions well. And then secondly, yeah, there are things like boards. There are ideally people on either your board of directors or your board of advisors, and they're different. If that's not clear, then that's a whole topic, that have seen this kind of thing before, and can provide some information about kind of get you past the initial hump.
How do you go into the back to the expeditionary for a second, and let's say we talked about how revenue is not necessarily something that we're talking about at first. We're talking about logos essentially, and figuring all that out. How do you know when to make a switch within that stage, right? When somebody is struggling, and I'm assuming there's a goal, I guess, that needs to be hit in terms of new logos closed, I guess, per quarter. What are you looking at? What information?
Yeah, so that first outside sales leader, the one that discovers the playbook, the goal, the exit criteria for this stage is, do they have something that's repeatable? And it's repeatable both in terms of the playbook. We can apply this way of processing leads into closed deals and happy customers, engaged customers. So is it a repeatable playbook, but also do we have a repeatable way of bringing on reps? And so that's part of the, they can figure out something that works to close deals, but they can also figure out how to go from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 reps. At that point, if you have something that you can reliably repeat, now the question is, how do you go from 6, 8 to 60? And that's when the organization should think to themselves, okay, what do we need to do that different kind of challenge? So that's really when a sales leader thinks to themselves, we have something repeatable, and now it's a question of how do we replicate it without the wheels coming off? They should realize to themselves, I'm not now discovering the thing to repeat, I'm figuring how to repeat it. And that's a different kind of challenge.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense.
If on the other hand, you're still thinking like, when we do this over and over, we keep getting unpredictable outcomes, then you still have a repeatability challenge.
Right. So they haven't solved, in other words, let's say they are repeating, but the output from that input, I guess, that they're putting is there are too many variables and it's not predictable. So you need to almost figure out, okay, well, this process that we thought we figured out, we haven't really figured out yet. We got to go back to the beginning. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Now I mentioned 2 kinds of repeatability. One is on how you process leads into engaged customers. If you're doing that and you're getting, consistent input, but you're getting very unreliable output, then you haven't figured out the sales motion, the repeatability there. There's also repeatability on bringing on reps. If you're not able to reliably bring in reps and figure out how to turn them into productive reps, then that's also an aspect of repeatability.
Right. And that onboarding is in there as well, obviously, right? Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
One of the things you mentioned when you and I were talking offline before we recorded was about sort of some of the frustrations that you have with sales leaders and the way that they communicate in their meetings. Talk to me a little bit about that for those sales leaders who are out there that are unaware of themselves or unaware of how they should communicate to the Samuel Clemens.
Yeah, it's an irony that comes with being a very successful sales leader, is that you tend to be good at sales. And what happens is you get sales leaders, for example, who come into a board meeting and will not realize that the audience has changed. In the room now are not prospects. In the room now are board members, investors, executives, and the goal of the meeting is different. Mm-hmm. What this audience wants is the unvarnished, objective, the upside, but also very much the risks and the downside, the pragmatic look at things. And so what you don't want to try and do is use the sales motion on that different audience. You need to essentially change the way you interact. Mm-hmm. To be much more pragmatic, absolutely objective, and not spin. To put it bluntly, you need to stop selling in the board meeting.
The expeditionary,
and that's hard for sales leaders. Of all of the leaders in a company, sales leaders tend to be very, very good at the in-person communication, and so it's very it's an irony that they need to kind of figure out how to turn that off.
I would imagine that the expeditionary sales leader is much more inclined, I'll say, to sell at the board meeting than, say, the process-oriented one who is used to operationalizing and data and those types of things. I mean, I don't know. It's just a guess, but
yeah, the expeditionary sales leader. If you were a director at your previous company, you may not have had a lot of board exposure.
Yes, right.
And so you're not as practiced at how to spin in a board meeting,
right?
Which is good.
Okay, well, that's true, right?
Pretty good in a board meeting because you don't know how to do it. Therefore, you're just giving it straight.
Right.
What's worse is you get someone who's actually very good at the board level conversations, and that can be actually, ironically enough, a challenge.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. All right, we're coming up on the top of the hour here, but do you have some time for what I'm calling the rapid fire 5?
Hit me with it.
5 questions. This is something I've been doing lately, guys. Who've been listening to this podcast. I'm trying to do it more consistently, although I think I skipped on a couple of times. But 5 questions is just sort of because I'm curious, and it'll just help us learn a little bit more about our guest. All right. So first question: what are you most excited about right now, either personally or professionally?
Very excited about this company Reprise that I'm incubating with my previous colleagues. Serving sales and marketing leaders. It's a problem that we had ourselves at every single previous company we've done. And so I personally have felt the pain in building demo environments. And so I'm excited to go and solve this.
And hearing you talk about it, frankly, is exciting. And it sounds like a problem that certainly needs to be solved. I love the things that you can point and click and just sort of drag, and I'm like geek out over that stuff all day long. So that's good to know. What activity do you miss the most since we began this whole shelter in place thing?
For me, it's meant a lot more time with family, which is something I haven't gotten a lot of over the last 8 years or so. And so the time with family has been wonderful. What I've been missing is the time with close friends. Not necessarily, meeting large groups of people. I don't miss that. That's not my personality. But meeting the 10 or 12 really close friends, not being able to do that has been tough.
Yeah. What keeps you motivated?
I like building things. I'm a builder. I've done, this is my 6th startup. All of the startups I've been at, I'm on the product side, the build side of the house. And so I love building things, seeing it ship, seeing people use it. It's one of the reasons why, even though I'm an investor, I also like still working on the operating side to kind of keep my hand in it.
Just keeps pulling you in, keeps pulling you there. Can you share a piece of advice or tool that you use that helps you stay productive? – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – Mhm.
I'm pretty hardcore about creating to-do lists, mainly because I'm absent-minded. And so I have to use task lists in order to balance from all the different directions, all the things that need to get done.
Do you have a particular app that you use, or just old school sort of pen and paper?
At the moment, it's just the reminders app in the Mac operating system, but it doesn't really matter. It's it's just a list. It could be a text file.
Cool. Okay.
I've used just text files in the past.
And what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Oh, easy. LinkedIn is great. I'm a big believer in LinkedIn for everything B2B. I haven't used a business card in over a decade, but they can also reach me at sam@accomplice.co if it's an investing thing, or sam@getreprise.com if it's about creating sales demos.
Absolutely. And I'll ask him to, if he has even a link specifically to, the demo page or demo, wherever you want to send it to, he can give it to me after we do this, and I'll put it in the show notes for sure. Sam Clemens, thank you for going over quota.
Jay, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.